So it is actually a great privilege to be on the stage today and to be presenting some keynotes of two very influential and inspirational women. And I'd like to start by introducing Ms. Annie Madden. Annie is a research PhD candidate at the University of New South Wales. She's also a community engagement and liaison officer and a research assistant at the Centre for Social Research in Health, also at UNSW. Prior to commencing her PhD and positions at CSRH, Annie was the Executive Officer of the Australian Injecting and Illicit Drug Users League, AVIL, for 16 years until April 2016. She was also the Executive Officer of the New South Wales Users and AIDS Association, NUA, from 1994 to 2000. She's a founding member and current board member of Harm Reduction Australia, is well published and has held numerous high-level appointments, and has dedicated her entire professional career to promoting the health and human rights for people who use and inject illicit drugs and people in drug treatment. Today, she'll be talking to us about a road less travelled, representing people who use drugs. Thank you, Annie. Let's welcome her. The green button goes forward and your red goes back.
Great, thank you. Okay. Thank you. Before I commence, I'd like to also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Kulin Nation, and thank them for allowing us to meet on their land today, to pay my respects to elders past and present, and to extend that respect to Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people in the audience today. It's been a while since I've done one of these, so just bear with me if I'm a little bit nervous. It's an immense privilege to have been invited to give what I understand is nominally called the Consumer Keynote at the conference this year. Although I'm no longer working for AVIL, as has been said, and it's therefore no longer part of my job description, so to speak, to represent people who use drugs or have used drugs at the national level, I accepted this invitation to speak to you today because I felt that after more than 2 decades of representing one of the most stigmatised and really, let's face it, most despised often groups in the community at the highest levels, it would be worth taking a moment to reflect on that experience and to speak frankly with you, those working in and around the AOD sector, about what it is truly like to represent those who are on the other side of the counter, the desk, the bulletproof glass, whatever it may be. To reflect on what I see as the state of play for consumer representation and engagement in the Australian AOD sector, and I guess to ultimately ask, is the meaningful, and I stress that word, meaningful participation of people who use drugs in the policies and research that affect their lives even possible in such a stigmatising and criminalising policy and legislative environment? One thing I should say by way of introduction is this keynote is not going to be a standard sort of academic keynote with lots of slides and research data. That's not to say that presentations involving lots of slides and research data are somehow negative. Indeed, my newfound status as a PhD candidate and research assistant has given me a new appreciation of the fine art of data interpretation and presentation. Suffice to say, however, that I decided that such an approach was largely not appropriate for this presentation. Having said that, I will drop the odd slide and research finding in, but for the most part I want to take this rare opportunity to speak from a more personal viewpoint, to reflect on what it's like to represent people who use drugs across a huge variety of contexts, and hopefully start a conversation with you as the AOD sector about this largely neglected topic. The final thing I will say by introduction is that it is important to say up front that although many of my comments can be applied to representing people who use illicit drugs more broadly, my personal lived experience and the bulk of my experience as a drug user advocate relates to injecting drug use, opioid pharmacotherapy, and the people who inject and who are on opioid pharmacotherapy. My comments, therefore, should be seen largely in that context unless I specify otherwise. Make no mistake, Representing people who use drugs, particularly people who inject drugs and people on opioid pharmacotherapy, is hard. I don't necessarily mean complex, although it can be that too, but mostly I just mean it's not easy. You might even say it's difficult. Why is it so hard? Well, first of all, it's hard on a personal level. No one should ever underestimate the potential implications for the individuals concerned of representing people who use drugs. For the most part, we are talking about an illegal and highly stigmatising range of practices that can have extremely negative implications for people's children, their families, their employment, rental housing, even their day-to-day relationships with the person at the local coffee shop. You make the call to do more traditional media and or social media as a drug user representative, and mark my words, it will change your life. And the impact at a personal level is not always positive. Unfortunately, I learnt some of these lessons the hard way. I want to tell you a story about one of my formative experiences as a drug user representative that definitely changed my life and the lives of those around me. I'm old, basically. I've been doing this stuff for a long time now. And way back in 1999, when I was still relatively new to peer-based drug user organisations, that is, I'd only been involved in them for 10 years rather than more than 20, as is the case now, I was the then CEO at NUA, the New South Wales Users and AIDS Association, and Bob Carr, the then Premier of New South Wales, decided to hold Australia's first parliamentary drug summit. As you can appreciate, it was a really exciting time for the AOD sector in New South Wales and Australia, really. There was a reasonable expectation that this extraordinary summit would deliver some real change for the sector and for people who use drugs and people in AOD treatment in New South Wales. Of course, with the benefit of hindsight, we know that the 1999 New South Wales Drug Summit did deliver change, most notably in the form of Australia's first, and I can now say not our only, medically supervised injecting centre, but also some other important legislative and policy and funding changes. That much is known. But what people don't really know is about some of the intensive advocacy that went on behind the scenes across that Drug Summit week in 1999 that without a doubt contributed to those important summit outcomes. The New South Wales Drug Summit was held across a whole week and it took place on the floor of the Parliament itself. About 70 or 80 community representatives, that is non-parliamentary representatives, from the AOD sector, NGOs, etc., were invited to spend the week in New South Wales Parliament with New South Wales politicians. We discussed and debated issues across the week, listened to invited speakers, held intensive side workshops, and ultimately at the end of the week, we voted as a group on the floor of Parliament, along with parliamentarians, for a series of summit recommendations. It was an extraordinary experience. While I have little doubt there were loads of drug users in the room, of the 80-odd people invited from the community to attend the summit, I was one of only 2 people invited specifically as a drug user representative. The other person was also from NUA. It was a big deal and also an enormous responsibility. One of the things we could do as an invited participant is put our name forward to make an advocacy intervention to address all attendees on the floor of Parliament. I didn't have any plans to make such an intervention. I mean, we're talking about New South Wales Parliament, it's pretty intimidating. But late on day one, I was becoming increasingly concerned about how the New South Wales methadone program, because that's all we had back then, we didn't have BUP as yet, was being discussed within the summit. A combination of extremely biased invited speakers and poorly facilitated discussion had resulted in some parliamentarians openly questioning whether the methadone program was a good thing, because seemingly it just continued people's addiction. I'm sure you are familiar with the rhetoric. At any rate, my growing concern over the future welfare of the New South Wales methadone program and some active encouragement from progressive parliamentarians and senior AOD sector people around me resulted in me rather reluctantly putting my name forward on day 2 to make an advocacy intervention. There was just one small problem with this. I had completely forgotten that media is always present in Parliament. I proceeded to give my presentation on behalf of active drug users and people on methadone. I stood on the floor of New South Wales Parliament and declared myself an injecting drug user and a person on the New South Wales methadone program. But I also added proudly that I was a functional and ethical person responsible for multiple large government grants, a CEO of an NGO, that I had completed a university degree and had, at least at that point, strong and stable connections with my family and community. But it seems I have quite a reputation for doing, when I started talking about what it is like to experience the relentless and all-pervasive stigma and discrimination associated with being a person who injects drugs and a person on methadone, I faltered and became quite emotional. I talked about how sticky the shame and stigma associated with illicit drug use is, not just for users themselves, but for people's children and families as well. That it sticks to everyone and everything around you. I talked about people dying unnecessarily alone in back alleys and behind locked doors because they can't tell anyone about what they are doing. I said if there was one thing that was killing people who injected drugs, it was stigma and discrimination. Sadly, a case that still exists today. As I said this, I looked across and saw Bob Carr sitting just a few feet away from me. He had his head in his hands. He couldn't even look at me. When I finished, probably not that surprisingly given what I'd said in Parliament, there was quite a commotion and I was whisked away to do my very first live press conference in the bowels of Parliament House. I had flashes going off in my face, cameras everywhere, and of course, Piers Ackerman, the infamous tabloid journalist from the Sydney Daily Telegraph, appeared at the press conference. And as one online publication reported it, Piers made his presence felt at Madden's press conference, asking distasteful questions about whether her emotional speech could be attributed to her drug use and/or her state of mental health. In his signature loud and overbearing way, Piers barked out his boorish questions, embarrassing other journalists who genuinely wanted to understand the issue. Following the face-to-face attack at the press conference, Piers and his Daily Telegraph colleague Ray Chesterton took turns in the 2 days following to further slate me in print, as it were. Ray Chesterton was the first the following day with an editorial titled, "Annie is sick, erudite and pathetic," and stated that my drug use fell somewhere between repugnant and repulsive. Not to be outdone, Piers launched an even bigger attack on me the next day in a 2-page spread, complete with a caricatured cartoon-like image of me pale and gaunt, with long, stringy black hair, looking at myself in a mirror, with a fit hanging out of my arm, and a headline that said, "You're kidding yourself, Annie," and declared that it's not the discrimination that's killing the drug addicts of Sydney, he pronounced, it's the fact that they like to use drugs which have the capacity to kill. Not to mention, of course, the failed prohibitionist framework that to this day criminalises and stigmatises all involved and forces people underground and away from family, friends, information and support. No, it's just the drugs that have the capacity to kill, not the way that we force people to use them. No, never that. As it turns out, Ray and Piers' personal attacks on me had the opposite effect of what they had hoped for. And for the most part, parliamentarians, even the Conservative ones, and those in attendance at the summit, were offended on my behalf and rallied behind me. As it turned out, my intervention in New South Wales Parliament as a drug user representative was extremely newsworthy. The day I made this speech, I was on the main evening TV news bulletin on every station across the country. ABC Radio National ran my speech in full at 12 noon instead of their news bulletin. Every major newspaper and radio station wanted an interview, and this was prior to social media as we know it today. And I received hundreds of letters and emails and messages from drug users and their families. But while all of this really positive stuff was going on in terms of advocacy on the issues, the personal impact was also massive. As I said, I forgot that media was in Parliament, and as it turned out, it was a costly mistake to make. There's no need to go into the details, but suffice to say that as a direct result of the actions to represent people who inject drugs and people on methadone that day, I didn't speak to my mother or my siblings for almost 10 years. It's all right. I had embarrassed and ashamed them in a very public way. They were angry. They didn't want to hear about the importance of the cause or the injustices of prohibition. They just couldn't believe that I was one of those druggos that they had so been taught to despise. And it didn't end with family breakdown. I was also forced to move my house because my landlord suddenly needed the premises vacated, and my methadone prescriber embarked on an intensive period of supervised urine testing after having told me previously that urine testing was not needed in my case because I was obviously so stable and trustworthy. So, was I kidding myself, as Piers Ackerman declared all those years ago? Well, maybe I was. It wouldn't be the first time. But since that time, I've gone on to represent people who use drugs and people on OST at the highest levels, as has been said, including ministerial committees, prime ministerial advisory roles. I'm a member of the Prime Minister's Honour Roll for service to the AOD sector. I have represented the Australian Government as a person who injects drugs at the United Nations General Assembly no less than 3 times. The last time involved spending a full week in New York working with the then Australian Ambassador to the UN and Kevin Rudd, who was the Foreign Minister at the time, on a world first UN political declaration. Kidding myself? I don't really think so. As a drug user advocate, I've been fortunate to have some of the most amazing experiences and to have worked with some of the most incredible people and organisations. While everyone has their good days and bad days with what they do, for the most part, I wouldn't trade any of it for anything. But I do wish that the personal toll did not have to be so exacting for all of us. Which makes me ask, almost 20 years later, how far have we come with consumer representation and engagement in drug policy and research? Is it easier for people to speak out and represent their community effectively now, or are we still dealing with the same attitudes and barriers to meaningful participation as we were all those decades ago? Let's take a look. While not to suggest that it's absolutely perfect, it's fair to say that consumer or service user representation and engagement in policy and research is well and truly considered core business in areas such as mental health, disability, and to a lesser extent, youth services. Back in around 2007-8, in recognition of the overwhelming lack of progress on consumer participation in AOD settings, AVIL sought and gained funding for a multi-phase research and demonstration project to specifically examine the issue of consumer participation in AOD treatment settings. The project, called the Treatment Service Users Project, included 2 phases. The first, a qualitative social research project, and phase 2, a demonstration project involving 5 consumer representation demonstration projects in a variety of government and non-government settings. It is telling, I think, that the TSU project was the first research of its kind in the world, and it remains as some of the only research and evaluation on consumer participation in AOD settings to this day. Both phases of the project were done in collaboration with the Centre for Social Research in Health at UNSW and conducted across different types of treatment services, including pharmacotherapy, residential rehab, and inpatient detox in New South Wales, Victoria, and WA. The phase 1 research involved face-to-face interviews with service providers from almost 80 services and interviews with almost 200 consumers drawn from those same treatment services. This allowed us to make some reasonable correlations between the responses from the service providers and the consumers. So what did we find? In a nutshell, we found that although there was a great deal of interest in and overall support for consumer participation in AOD services among both service providers and consumers we interviewed, in practice there was very little consumer participation actually occurring in AOD treatment settings. Indeed, both parties seemed to be making the assumption about a lack of interest on behalf of the other party in consumer participation, which ironically was acting as a barrier to participation and engagement activities. So, for example, service providers assumed that consumers wouldn't be interested in consumer participation, and consumers were assuming that the service providers wouldn't want them involved in the service. Where consumer participation activities were occurring, they were generally low-level, more passive activities, such as suggestion boxes, information provision, complaints procedures, things like that of that nature, rather than high-level activities where there's more meaningful engagement, such as consumer councils, consumer involvement in service planning, or consumer input into policy development. There was also a lack of proper resourcing and high-level management support for consumer participation in AOD settings. Too often, any consumer participation that was happening was kind of left to one staff member who might have an interest in consumer participation, rather than being viewed as sort of core, essential business that's necessary for a high-quality health service provision. The problem with that, of course, is if that one staff member was to leave, then the whole project around consumer participation would inevitably come to a halt. The TSU project also identified that consumer participation in the opioid pharmacotherapy area is far more complex than consumer representation in some of the other areas of drug treatment or drug treatment settings, and even drug policy, such as therapeutic communities and those sorts of environments, mostly due to the extreme power imbalances and the boundaries between the clinician and the service user that are quite unique to pharmacotherapy, such as the regulations around the medications in pharmacotherapy, the design of clinics themselves with sort of glass barriers, security guards, supervised urinalysis. All of those things, hardly surprisingly, have a very negative impact on the capacity for meaningful consumer engagement. Finally, despite treatment consumers interviewed saying that they were very supportive of the idea of, or the concept of, consumer participation, things such as a lack of confidence in their skills and abilities, the belief that they didn't really have anything of value to offer, and concerns about confidentiality and being labelled as kind of different from other consumers, or being labelled as a difficult client if they were a consumer representative, were also identified as barriers to consumer participation in OST from the consumer perspective. In addition to these findings from Phase 1, the Phase 2 of the TSU project, the demonstration projects, uncovered just how far we have yet to go to achieve the meaningful engagement of consumers in AOD treatment settings. Of the 5 treatment services that applied to be the demonstration sites, not one was able to fully complete their consumer participation project that they themselves had developed and designed. They did achieve other outcomes, just not necessarily the outcomes they thought they were going to achieve in the planning stages. And some learnt some really quite valuable and important lessons in doing consumer participation in the AOD treatment context. But by and large, all of the demonstration projects had to confront the reality that consumer participation in the drug treatment context is not something you can just do on the side, and it is not something that a service does as a favour to the clients, but rather it is an integral part of a high-quality drug treatment service, and it requires proper resourcing, training and support for both staff and consumers, and a whole of organisation commitment to meaningful consumer engagement, particularly at the management and organisational policy levels. TSU clearly showed that without such a core commitment to consumer participation in AOD treatment settings, they would be doomed to be small-scale, ad hoc and tokenistic at best. So far, I've focused on consumer participation or engagement in drug treatment settings as one measure of how far we've come or haven't come on consumer participation and drug user representation over the past decades. Another important measure, in my view, is the area of drug user engagement in AOD research. On the positive side of the ledger, it could be argued that drug user organisations in particular have done much to improve the level of drug user engagement in research. Ongoing collaboration on a vast array of research projects and increasingly undertaking peer-driven research initiatives are helping to ensure that those most affected by the research being undertaken have a say in how that research is conducted, and perhaps more importantly, in interpreting the data and publishing the findings. As with other areas of consumer participation and drug user representation, however, there is still much to be done. As far back as 2003, AVIL published its national statement on ethical issues for research involving injecting and illicit drug users. Of course, I am completely biased as the author, but I believe it is still a unique and groundbreaking document, and the only statement of its kind in the world, and a statement that has been recognised by the main health and medical research funding body in Australia, the NHMRC. But sadly, many of the principles and practices it espouses are still not universally adopted by AOD researchers. I can't tell you how many times I was contacted over my many years at AVIL at the 11th hour by a panicked researcher asking for a letter of endorsement or support from AVIL for a project funding proposal to show there is consumer involvement in a project that I was just hearing about for the first time. Invitations to participate on project advisory committees for projects we had no involvement in developing, requests to help to recruit large numbers of participants without offering resourcing to support the organisation, conflicts over the ethics of paying participants, and disagreements over authorship, just to name a few areas of conflict and concern when it comes to consumer involvement and drug user representation in AOD research. Some researchers are, of course, much, much better than others in their commitment to genuine consumer engagement, and I am pleased to say that this is one area of consumer engagement that I do genuinely feel that there has been some progress. But some progress does not mean that all is okay, and there is still a very long way to go. I'd like to finish this section with some comments on the state of play in relation to the all-important area of drug user representation and advocacy in drug policy and law reform. In my over 25 years of representing people who inject drugs and use drugs, I can comfortably say without any fear of contradiction that I have attended more drug policy meetings, even high-level drug policy meetings, than I could poke a proverbial stick at, certainly more than I care to remember. But many does not mean easy once again. Like everyone, some days I was definitely more on my advocacy game than others. But one thing I can say, hand on heart, is that through my many, many meetings, I always tried to be aware that there were people, drug users, who were counting on me not only to be in the room, but to get things right on their behalf. People who never get to be in such meetings, whose lives are routinely and often profoundly affected by the decisions taken in those meetings. But I can tell you, it's far from easy to be the lone drug user advocate at the table. And believe me, more often than not, you are the only one at the table. To be the person who always has to bring the bad news story, to point out what's wrong, what's not working, what's absent but should be present, what's present but should be absent. The job of the advocate is always hard, but the job of the drug user advocate is especially difficult because of the profound and unrelenting nature of the many injustices, the extreme stigma, and the ongoing criminalisation caused by prohibition. You are asked to be dispassionate about issues and support compromises that you may not only fundamentally disagree with, but you also know will likely have direct negative implications for your own life and for the lives of those you care for deeply. It's hard to sit still when the conversation turns to those people, when you are one of those people. It's even harder to keep going to meeting after meeting when you know in your heart there is next to no chance of even the smallest amount of change, but you just keep going back in case that is the meeting, the day where the crack might open, the day where something might actually change. You keep going back because you know that if you don't, the voice of drug users will be absent, and you fear that it will be said, "We invited the drug users organisation, but no one came." Obviously, they don't care that much. There is a saying in the drug users movement that every time you go to one of these drug policy meetings where nothing changes, it takes a small chip off you until you don't have the heart or wherewithal to put yourself forward anymore. I would hope one day to be able to say that that saying has lost its meaning. Unfortunately, I don't think we can say that yet. In thinking about the issue of consumer participation and drug user representation, I titled my presentation today, "A Road Less Travelled." I did that because, much like the act of injecting drug use itself, the act of representing people who inject and/or use illicit drugs is most definitely something that most people will never do in their lifetime. What you might refer to as a road less travelled. But sometimes a road less travelled is less travelled for a reason. Sometimes, like in this particular instance, the road is less travelled for many reasons, and I hope I have started to illustrate why that might be the case in this presentation today. But despite these many reasons, there are also many people, I'd like to think a growing number of people and organisations, who are committed to increasing the voice of people who use drugs in AOD research, in policy, and in service planning and delivery. Australia is incredibly fortunate to have a strong and proud history of drug user organising, the envy of many countries. Although drug user organisations need a great deal more support and resourcing, there are currently some excellent and consumer participation and peer-based representation initiatives that drug user organisations are undertaking to build the numbers and capacity of drug user representatives. Some of these include the Consumer Academy that has just recently been started by NEWA and supported by some of the PHNs in New South Wales, peer networker projects that are being conducted by Harm Reduction Victoria, NEWA and WASUA in WA, and pharmacotherapy consumer projects at, once again, at Harm Reduction Victoria, at CARMA, and there are many other projects in the drug user organisations around the country. A small number of AOD treatment services are also undertaking consumer participation projects in New South Wales and Victoria, and perhaps elsewhere. But these initiatives are always hampered by the profound and all-pervasive stigma and discrimination that is ever present in this space. It is easy for everyone to support the concept of consumer participation and drug user organisations for that matter, and have all these expectations about what drug user organisations and drug user reps should and shouldn't be, that a certain drug user organisation doesn't have enough of this type of drug user or that type of consumer and needs to do more in this space or that space. But I ask you to think about that invisible wall of stigma and discrimination that keeps people from speaking up, that makes people's lives unmanageable, that grinds you down and keeps you silent and compliant. The constant fear that consumer representatives have of being found out to be a current drug user when they've been masquerading as a person in recovery because it's just easier that way. The fear of being judged, again, when you are just so tired of being constantly judged. Of speaking up and being punished, or worse, losing your children, losing your job, your home, your freedom. It's not easy to be a drug user representative, and we are damn lucky to have the ones we do have who are willing to stand up despite the consequences and the personal price and say what needs to be said. I want to finish my presentation today with some thoughts on equality. Yes, equality is something we've been talking a lot about in the Australian community lately, isn't it? And no matter how much I unreservedly support someone's right to be able to legally marry the person they love, regardless of sexual orientation, I've found myself feeling profoundly sad in the face of the marriage equality debate. And this is because it has underscored for me just how far we still have to go before we could ever hope to have a similar level of mainstream conversation about the fundamental rights, basic dignity, and self-determination of people who use and inject drugs. And the single reason why we have so far to go, why it is even just beyond even imagining such a conversation in relation to the rights of drug users, in my opinion, is because of one thing and one thing only. Drug use is illegal. And if you think that's an exaggeration to say that prohibition and the current drug laws are our biggest barriers to change, then you need only look at the history of gay rights in Australia. Without a doubt, it was the law reform that finally made homosexuality legal, largely in response to the HIV epidemic, that fundamentally changed everything in relation to gay rights and down the line GLBTQI rights in Australia. Without that fundamental law reform all those years ago, there is no way we would be having the very mainstream discussion we are having today about marriage equality. Believe me, I would like to feel nothing but joy and generosity in relation to the marriage equality issue, but I can only find myself asking why the same health and medical professionals and services and organisations who are being very publicly supportive of this issue on social media, on their websites, even on the streets protesting, because it is just a matter of human rights, aren't publicly vocal on the very same issues relating to people who use drugs. The difference, of course, is the illegality. This is why drug law reform is ultimately an issue for all of us. The levels of stigma and discrimination that are routinely justified on the basis that drug use is illegal and therefore immoral are profound. Judgment and vilification pervades every aspect of drug users' lives, from their interactions with family and community, to the workplace, with authorities, and most certainly in their everyday interactions with the AOD treatment sector. If you believe in basic rights, if you believe in human dignity, you must support the need for drug law reform, and more than that, you should say that you do, out loud, often, and with the kind of pride that says you really mean it.